Thank you, Kyle. Thanks for bringing me here. I have to point out that Dave Theobald graduated from our department, so you're kind of on a run here in terms of Boulder folks. So I'm going to take the title from our current NSF award that is just finishing up now on wildfire regime shifts in Patagonia as a way of organizing quite a bit of work that we've done over about 30 years. I'm going to be leaving out a few details. My goal is to give you a good overview. I won't spend a lot of time on detailed data interpretation, but the papers behind this talk are, for the most part, vast majority of them are published. I want to acknowledge the people who have done all the heavy lifting here. So this group of current collaborators includes several recent PhDs, includes a recent PhD of one of those PhDs, so I have an academic grandson included in there, and people that I've been collaborating with in some cases for more than 20 years. So, for those of you who follow fire internationally, you might be aware of the fact that this is a record fire year in Patagonia. 2015 has seen extensive fires in the Araucaria region in Chile, which appear in acreage to have broken the previous record that was set just recently in the year 2002. And these are in iconic national parks, so they've gotten a lot of national and international attention. In Nahuelhuapi National Park, one of the areas where we've worked extensively, we had record fire years in 1996 and 1999. And then a little bit further south, in the area around Los Alerces National Park, this year, 2015, is also a record fire year, in that case based on comparison of the documentary records going back to the 1940s. So this kind of raises a silly question that gives me a basis for organizing the talk, and that is this indicative of a substantive change in fire regimes? And so that's the basic theme that I'm going to develop here. So in looking at global scale patterns of fire, recent work by Max Moritz and collaborators has identified some of the coarse scale predictors. This is not news to, I'm sure, anyone here, but it's a good way to just remind me of some of the topics that are relevant to this talk. So we're working now at sort of a regional scale, and these coarse scale controls of fire activity that have been applied to global scale fire patterns also apply at a regional scale. So I'll talk a little bit about long-term average climate conditions as an influence on fire activity. In contrast to the work that's been done at a global scale by Moritz and colleagues, I'll talk about interannual variability and its importance, which has not been taken into account at the global scale predictions of future fire. And I'll talk a bit about resources to burn, mostly from the perspective of how those are changing and likely to continue to change. So that's where I'm going to get into some topics related to feedbacks. So first I'll give you an introduction to the broad-scale biogeography of the region, talk a little bit about the fire regimes that have been studied, and briefly summarize some information about climate trends and interannual as well as decadal scale variability. Then I want to focus a little bit on fire-promoting ecological feedbacks, and I'll make a few brief comments about land use as contributing factors to changes in fire regimes here. So, looking at southwestern South America, keep in mind that the big climate pattern is related to westerly circulation here. There is a gradient in rainforest vegetation from about 40 degrees latitude, where you have species-rich Valdivian rainforests. As you move into cooler latitudes, you get into the Patagonian rainforest with fewer tree species, and then Magellanic rainforest at the high latitudes. And I'll be talking about fire regimes just to the north here, throughout the Valdivian rainforest region and the Patagonian rainforest region, both on the Chilean side of the Andes and mostly on the Argentinian side of the Andes. And actually, these rainforests do extend a little bit across the Andes before you get into the rain shadow of the Andes, where there's a very steep precipitation gradient. And this reddish color here is termed cool temperate Nothofagus forest. Nothofagus is the most important genus in this region. So-called southern beaches includes both evergreen and deciduous angiosperm trees. And as we go across the Andes, then we have a very strong, obviously, precipitation gradient and strong gradients in fire regimes. So the documentary fire records from Chile and Argentina tend to be rather short. You can see here that we were able to do an analysis based on records starting in 1984. Prior to that, the documentary records generally are not considered to be reliable in Chile. We have longer records from the national parks in Argentina, but they're fragmentary. They just include national parks, but not the entire landscape. You see in this map here a slightly extended version of the map that I showed you previously, extending from the deserts of northern Chile through Mediterranean-type evergreen, sclerophyll, shrublands, and woodlands in central Chile through the rainforest region. Looking at this index of the area burned annually and corrected on the basis of the amount of forest type in each one of those regions to burn, that in the northern area, we have reduced fire activity on an average basis for the obvious reason: lack of biomass to burn, just lack of resources to burn. At the other end of this latitudinal gradient, we also have a decline as a result of the lack of weather conditions conducive to fire. So this is an area at very high latitude of pretty much constantly cool, moist conditions. And as you would expect, and as is predicted from the so-called varying constraints hypothesis of determinants of fire activity, it's in the Mediterranean zone where you get maximum annual occurrence of fire. So plenty of biomass to burn, and summer weather conditions are suitable for fire basically every year. In our study area, centered on 41 degrees latitude, that's where we actually get the greatest variance. We've got plenty of biomass to burn, but you only get occasional years of weather conditions that are suitable for really extensive fires. So, given the rather short documentary fire records, we do benefit greatly from the fact that we've got some really good fire scar recording tree species throughout an extensive latitudinal zone in the Andean Patagonian region. So centered on about 38 degrees latitude, extending down to about 43 degrees latitude, these two conifers, Araucaria and Ostracedrus, are typical of the dry forests and woodlands, good fire scar recording species. Then the very long-lived, over 3,000 years, Fitzroya, giant conifer, is also a good fire scar recording species, and Pilgaridendron, which occurs a bit further south, both in the Valdivian and the rainforest, Valdivian and the Patagonian rainforests. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been gradually doing over many years in terms of fire history studies. First, the Araucaria region, then the Ostracedrus region, where as you go from the relatively dry ecotone with the Patagonian steppe, all of this out here is steppe, towards the west, you get into rainforest, still on the Argentine side of the Andes, where we have some of the Fitzroya. And then Pilgaridendron is common throughout actually from the Valdivian rainforest all the way to Tierra del Fuego. The area that we've mostly studied it is in the northern part of the Patagonian rainforest region. So, starting with Araucaria, It is an extremely thick-barked species. This is a full-size imitation Swiss Army knife for scale here. So it's really, really hard to kill a tree by fire with that kind of thick bark. It resprouts after fire from root suckers. It resprouts from root crown sprouting, and the branches also will resprout after fire. So it's you have to have a really severe fire to kill araucaria. It's a good fire scar forming species, and just so no one will ask it, no, we don't sample that kind of site because that would have been used repeatedly for heating up lunch for years and years. So that's not an actual fire scar sample site for us. So the fire regime in the Araucaria region varies along the precipitation gradient from really dry areas in the eastern area towards the Patagonian steppe, towards areas with well over 2,000 meters, or millimeters rather, of annual precip, quite wet forests, so that towards the Patagonian steppe, fire is pretty much dependent on grass fuels. It's clearly fuel limited. As we get into the heart of the Andes, under much higher precipitation, we have higher fire severities, but much lower frequency, dependent on extreme drought. A couple of our collaborators and students have worked on fire history in Araucaria forests. The data are not collected from those extremes at all. They're collected from the middle portions of those gradients for kind of obvious reasons, just lack of fire at the extremes. And these are indications of fire years with the little vertical lines. I suspect that most people are familiar with these sorts of diagrams. These are combined data sets from numerous sites in Tolhuaca and Villarrica National Park in Chile. These are data sets based on about 20 fire-scarred sampled trees in sites of about 2 square kilometers that were searched for fire scars. So these are your classic composite fire interval diagrams. And there's a lot of very site-specific interpretation that is in the papers describing these patterns. But some of the general patterns that we see is that in the mid-19th century, there tended to be an increase in fire occurrence from historical accounts. Some of that can be attributed to Mapuche, Native Americans, actually being expelled out of Chile across into Argentina. Then late in the 19th century, we had European colonization of northern Patagonia, which also was associated with increased burning. In Chile, everything was a little bit slower in terms of the European, Chilean colonization of the area in the 1930s, 1940s, associated with increased burning. And we've got highly variable expression of fire exclusion. So, people always ask, well, how about fire suppression? Well, it depends on where, how effective it's been. You can see that with the aggregated data, at least in these 2 national parks, there hasn't been an extreme difference during the modern fire suppression period, which would be basically from about 1960 onwards in those areas. The national parks in this area on the Argentine side of the Andes were created in the 1940s. You do see a decrease in fire occurrence, but we attribute most of the decrease that starts much earlier to the cessation of intentional burning by the Native American population when they were basically killed off or expelled from that area. A little bit further south in the Austersages region, we have patterns that are a lot easier to interpret and are more consistent in comparison with the Araucaria region, where there's still lots of uncertainties. So centered on about 40 degrees latitude on the eastern side of the Andes, we've developed pretty extensive data sets based on fire scar sampling of Austersages, which is a species with moderately thick bark. So it is fairly good as a fire scar recording species. It will survive, at least surface fires. It also forms post-fire cohorts in the moister areas that are further to the west towards the Andes. And, sorry, let's go back here. I think I turned it off. Thank you. So, towards the Patagonian steppe, grass fuels are very important for fire to occur. So actually we get a lagged effect of increased fire occurrence following moisture years. So grass fuels tend to limit fire occurrence. As we move into the Andes in the much denser forests where the Ostracedrus mixes with the evergreen Nothofagus dombae, the evergreen beech, we get plenty of biomass to burn, but fire in this environment is dependent on extreme drought. These are some of the fire scar records from the ecotone with the steppe. So these are Ostracedrus woodlands for the most part here. And you can see that, following the cessation, or following the demise of the Native American population at many sites, there was a pretty abrupt termination of burning. National parks were not created until about the 1940s. You still see some effect of fire exclusion at most sites right up to the modern time period. And this fits a pattern that's a narrative that applies to some other ecosystems as well. We had widespread indigenous burning that ceased pretty abruptly 1890s, 1900. And we've got plenty of evidence of woody encroachment based on historical photographs, such as this one taken in 1896 and this in 1985. We've done a lot of work on the woody encroachment. It's not just fire exclusion. Fire exclusion is necessary for it to occur, but the whole timing and pattern of it is also related to variables such as livestock impacts and short periods of above average moisture availability explain it. But without fire exclusion, we generally would not have the encroachment by the conifer, the Ostracedrus, and numerous tall shrubs, Lomatias, Scinas, and so on. In that same sector at about 40 degrees latitude, if we move into the Andes further west, get into areas generally with precipitation, mean annual precipitation of about 2,000 millimeters or so, we don't have a lot of fire scars to work with. So most of the work that we've done there has been based on post-fire cohorts, populations that develop after quite high severity fires. This is just a compilation of sites that we worked on, about 31 sites over about a 100-kilometer north-south area. You can see that we did have some pre-European cohorts developing, and the time period of massive European settlement is about 1890, early 1900s here, and it's represented by a very strong peak in terms of cohorts. This is an area where, along a transect from the steppe into the wet Andean forests, about a 7,000 hectare area where we mapped all the fires, that we could anyway. This is the westernmost sector, which shows an analogous pattern. Small amount of fire prior to the 19th century, and then a substantial increase at the time of European colonization when they were intentionally trying to convert forests to other land uses. Along that transect, about 40 degrees latitude, if you keep going to the west, get deep into the Andes, a little bit further south actually, very, very wet forests where the mean annual precip is at least 3,000 millimeters. This is where we get the giant Fitzroya. And we started working there in the early 1990s, and we were quite surprised to find fire scars that go just about to the crown on these 60-meter tall trees. These are about 3 meters in diameter often. It's most of the big trees that we core there, we get at least 1,000 rings out of them. We'd go further, but we end up breaking increment bores and so on. But yeah, there are many trees in this forest that are over 2,000 years. The arrows here represent fire scar dates in a stand like this. These are tree ages over here for the Fitzroya. Notice that we had, and it's a very small number of trees that we aged in this stand. You can see that we had trees that predate about 1,200 years AD, and they survived these two fires in the 1500s and 1700s. Those fires were severe enough so that we get post-fire abundant establishment of the associated species, the fire-sensitive species, Nothofagus dombei and Saxcothea. These are fire records for some other Fitzroya forests. There have been very few that we've actually been able to sample, and you can see that you have very long intervals in some cases between fires. But somewhat surprisingly, even in the rainforests, we do find evidence of fire in the past. And it's some of those Fitzroya forests that burned in 2015. And we're very interested in getting into the field to see whether or not those giant trees survived the 2015 fire events as well. So moving further south into the Patagonian rainforest area, Andres Holtz finished a dissertation a couple of years ago on fire history in this vegetation type. I'll show you just a few generalizations. Within the Patagonian rainforest region, most species are fire sensitive. Most of them are thin-barked, and they're fairly easily killed by fire. The only species that has thick enough bark to survive and record fire scars is the Pilgarodendron, the conifer, and again, quite long-lived. You can find individuals that are over 1,000 years. In the well-drained rainforest areas, where you don't have waterlogging, fires are infrequent and clearly dependent on very extreme drought. But in these wetland areas, fires are very frequent. The surface vegetation on these wetland areas dry out enough to allow fires in most years, so that the fire intervals that Andres documented in this kind of habitat here are on the order of around 10 years or even less at spatial scales of 2 or 3 hectares of searching. Somewhat surprising again. Some of those fires during extreme droughts get into the tall, well-drained forest, but it's fairly rare. Yeah, this is a composite of many sites, many trees, about 240 trees, on the island of Chiloé and in northern Aysén in the Patagonian rainforest area. And the main thing I want to point out here is that there is a long record of some fire occurrence, mostly from those wetland sites and with Pilgarodendron, and especially since about 1950 onwards, there's an increase in the number of fire years, substantial increase. And I'll talk a little bit about why we think that's been happening in a second. So for Nothofagus species in general, fire scars are very difficult to work with because once Nothofagus is wounded the first time by a fire, it tends to rot. So we are doing some work with fire scars on Nothofagus pumilio, but it's miserable stuff to work with. It's not going to yield a lot of information. Ignacio Mundo has been working with data that we've collected, samples that we've collected actually from Magallanes in the far south up to the Chubut region here along this border. It's got about 10 sites, each one with about 20 fire-scarred samples. And I think the oldest date he's been able to come up with is about 1890 or so. Most of the dates start about 1920 or so. And the data are not completely analyzed yet, but generally they show that in the driest area of the Nothofagus pumilio forest, so that would be, for example, at low elevation here, where it's ecotonal with the Patagonian steppe, you can have fairly frequent fire occurrence. So far, we have not been able to show synchrony of those fire dates over large areas. So it appears that these are very patchy, small, as well as low severity fires that are occurring in this quite dry habitat. In contrast, towards higher elevation, wetter areas, the fires are stand-replacing fires, high-severity fires. One of the interesting components of this vegetation is the tall bamboo, which you can see here, which is a very important fuel. Basically, in all the work that we've done on the spatial behavior of fire in these landscapes, once a fire gets into a bamboo thicket, it just keeps going. It just does not stop. And that's true regardless of whether the bamboo is alive or dead. These bamboo species synchronously, gregariously flower and die at long intervals, which intuitively, of course, creates the expectation of extreme fire hazard. But we've generally found that even if the bamboo is green, it is extremely flammable as well. So you don't have to depend on a flowering event for the bamboo to do its thing for fire. Now, Nothofagus pumilio, which occurs over that huge latitudinal gradient, has been the target of a lot of our recent research. It's easily killed by fire, very thin-barked. It is an obligate seeder. Depends on seed production for regeneration, post-fire establishment. It does not resprout after fire. We have observed, and many of the foresters have observed, that often following fire, regeneration fails. And there are a number of factors that have been documented at different sites to be contributing to that. So in some cases, it's just lack of seeds because the fires can be very, very extensive. Like this area originally would have been a Nothofagus pumilio forest. Microclimate, soil moisture, lack of nitrogen in the soil, as well as herbivore impacts. This has been documented in numerous papers by our group and by other researchers. So, to move to the topic of climate trends and variability, we're using gridded data sources here just as a way to summarize a broad-scale pattern, but there are limitations to these gridded data sources, reflecting the fact that there are very few climate stations in the whole region. So you can see that when we look at 40 to 45 degrees latitude at the growing season temperature, and also further south, 45 to 50 degrees latitude, we experience warming. Okay? And that's a pattern that we see in individual stations that we have confidence in, too. In the case of precipitation during the growing season, looks like a slight decline in precipitation. There's been some recent work by René Garraud using reanalysis data as a complement to the station data because of all the problems that exist with station data, where you basically model your climate data from the condition of the atmosphere, which is the pretty standard procedure in climate science now. And his results show, a decline of somewhere close to 400 millimeters of annual precipitation at a decadal time scale within our key study areas right here. The station records from places like Valdivia, right through here, also show that precipitation decline. So we're getting a trend towards warmer and drier conditions across most of Patagonia. Doesn't apply to the southernmost area at about 50 degrees latitude, but the rest of it. And there are two well-known sources of variability, so-called climate drivers. I'm sure that everyone knows about the El Nino Southern Oscillation. I won't say much about that, but what is less familiar to folks who live in the northern hemisphere is the so-called Southern Annular Mode. It's also known as the Antarctic Oscillation. So this is an oscillation or mode that is analogous to what's called NAM, the North Atlantic, or the Northern Annular Mode, rather. Except it's much simpler than what you see in the northern hemisphere because you don't have the blockage effect of so much landmass in the southern hemisphere. And it's this is indexed as the pressure differences between Antarctica and mid-latitudes around 40 to 50 degrees latitude. It's a useful index because it tells us what the behavior of the westerlies is. So there's been a trend towards positive SAM since the index was created about 1948. And that positive trend, so now we're talking about decadal trends, is indicative then of a shift in the westerlies to higher latitudes, which means then that the storm tracks obviously are occurring further south, higher latitudes. We're getting less stormy weather in the core of our study area at 40 to 45 degrees latitude. And there are bunches of studies that have shown the teleconnection of the climate parameters in Patagonia to the movement of SAM, or to the upward trend in SAM. So this is the annual version of the index. Southern annular mode is predictive of weather conditions at a broad range of temporal scales from just a few weeks to seasonal and annual time scales. So don't think of it as an oscillation in the sense of ENSO at a few years. This is something that is predictive of weather conditions even at sub-monthly scales, and then has a long-term trend, pretty impressive one, so that we have entered into for a long time now a multi-decadal time period of positive SAM, which the climate modelers have debated some of the causal explanations for. The two hypotheses, both of which have a lot of support, is that it's mainly a response to stratospheric ozone depletion at high latitude. The models that assume that ozone depletion will decline, is declining and will continue to decline, are then compared to the effects of the greenhouse gases on future SAM, so that regardless of whether it's ozone depletion or greenhouse gas increases that have generated this increase in SAM, it's something that's going to continue in the future. It's not likely to go away, which is useful from a predictive perspective. So a couple of years ago, Ricardo Villalba, one of my former students, published a very important synthesis of tree ring data from the southern hemisphere, New Zealand, Tasmania, and southern South America, which showed a very strong influence of this upward multi-decadal trend of SAM on tree growth in Tasmania, New Zealand, and southern South America. These two tree species, Ostracaedrus and Araucaria, are trees that grow and were sampled in areas specifically where moisture is limiting to their growth. And you can see here the correlations of their growth with SAM, a negative correlation, and a pretty steep decline in tree growth for those species. And these are regional chronologies, literally based on many hundreds of tree cores. It's a very striking pattern. Now, in addition to a trend towards warmer, drier conditions in Patagonia, there appears to have been a shift in the occurrence of lightning. So these are data from all the national parks in northern Patagonia, from about 37 degrees to 43 degrees latitude. And you can see that when summer temperature is plotted, about 1976, we get this shift. It's a well-known climatic shift, which people have attributed to shifts in the Pacific decadal oscillation, or more generally, shifts in sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. And based on the national park records, we've also had a substantial increase in the number of reported lightning-ignited fires. When I first started working in this area in the early 1980s, the local experts just said, no, we don't get lightning-ignited fires. It just does not happen. Well, in their own records, park records, it's actually well documented that there are some lightning-ignited fires, and this appears to be increasing. The actual mechanism, climate mechanism for why this is happening is not clear, but it is certainly plausible that with the shift of the westerlies poleward, further south, that it's easier for subtropical warm, moist air to reach the interior of Patagonia. But that's very speculative. So based on that documentary record of fire currents from 1984 to 2008, we studied the teleconnections that affect climate along this gradient from central Chile to high latitudes, and also related fire activity to the indices of the Southern Annular Mode, Antarctic Oscillation, and ENSO. And the circles here indicate the different districts for which we found significant relationships. The arrows indicate differences in the signs of the correlations. But you can see that in the fuel amount limited area, central Chile, the dry part of Chile, we have an influence of AAO on fire currents, which is mediated through increased precipitation, increased fine fuels, and increased fire. We get the opposite pattern when we move into the biomass-rich areas, where drought-associated, warmer temperatures associated with AAO are actually quantitatively the stronger driver of fire currents here. But ENSO also plays an important role. In this area through here, in the south, say the Lake District, and getting over into the Chilean Lake District and across the Andes here, warmer, drier summers are associated with El Nino. So that's somewhat counterintuitive because most people are aware of El Nino being associated with much wetter conditions in central Chile. But it's actually the summer association of weather conditions with El Nino that explained the patterns in the data here. Okay, so I'm not going to walk us through all the tree ring studies that we've published on this, but I'll just summarize a couple of the main findings. So from about 37 degrees latitude to about 46 degrees latitude, we see in the tree ring records that are pretty robust for at least 300 years, strong regional synchrony that's driven both by ENSO and interannual variability in the Antarctic Oscillation Index. Both humans and lightning are important sources of ignition. In the documentary records, the number of, in the Lake District here, in the Ostrasagus area through here, the number of ignitions is much higher that are attributed to humans, but the actual acreage of area burned is about equal between lightning ignitions and human set ignitions. The Aboriginal populations, just by looking at spatial associations with historical accounts and our tree ring record or with our archaeological evidence, shows that there is a spatial association, that we can detect an Aboriginal influence. In most cases, we interpret that as an amplifying influence over climate. The climate generally appears to be much more controlling on those years of extreme fire behavior where high percentages of trees would be scarred over very large areas. And then a much stronger human signal is associated with European settlement, which occurred at different time periods throughout this north-south gradient, so associated with different climate conditions too. But there's a very, very strong synchrony there. And in terms of fire suppression, it's extremely variable throughout this whole region. And in most cases, it's not actual suppression, it's just exclusion of previously intentionally set fires. Okay, so moving to the next theme then, ecological feedbacks. There are sort of three key elements here. The tall, closed forests, the rainforest, the mesic forest, and even relatively dry forests are hard to burn. They only burn under the most extreme weather conditions. And I'll show you that quantitatively they're less likely to burn than the tall shrublands. The warmer climate conditions, as well as the effects of introduced animals, are impeding tree regeneration. So that contributes to a shift from the burned tall forests to tall shrublands. And I'll make a few comments about some of the mechanisms behind these changes. So this has been our working hypothesis for about 20 years now. We've got different types of tall forest dominance here. Two different species of Nothofagus and Ostracedrus. These are mostly occurring in pure stands. And there's evidence that at a regional scale, following fires, they are shifting to dominance by the bamboos, by the shrubby species of Nothofagus, and by tall shrubs such as Diostea, Scinas, and so on. All of the dominants of the tall forests are obligate seed reproducers. All of these dominants are vigorous resprouters after fire. Fuel recovery is very slow at these sites, even a year or two after a fire, because the resprouting, you've got rapid fuel recovery in the shrublands, the burned shrublands. The obligate seeding trees are less browse resistant. They're easily either killed or at least dwarfed by the introduced livestock, deer and European hares. In contrast, the resprouting shrubs are highly browse resistant. In this kind of vegetation, we have gaps in terms of the vertical distribution of fine fuels, from a rather low overstory to nothing, and then a tall overstory beginning at 20 meters, maybe going to 50 meters in height. We've got continuous vertical fuels. Think of tall chaparral, for example, in the shrublands. We've got cool microclimates in the less flammable forests, and we've got hot, dry microclimate in the more flammable shrublands. So that sort of hypothesis originated from just sitting there and staring at some landscape patterns where we've got these sharp boundaries between the tall mesic Nothofagus pumilio forest and, in this case, recently burned tall shrubland, resprouting in 1912. That was not my first field trip, though. After 1908 burn. And these patterns persist in the landscape, 1985, 2007. And you see this everywhere in Patagonia. It's been the source of lots of curiosity and wild ideas, actually. Well, it turns out that the occurrence of fire is much more frequent in those tall shrublands than in the fire-resistant mesic forests. When we overlay maps of, for example, this recent fire, the crosshatched area occurred in 1999, with this map of burns in 1908, you can see that there is a substantial amount of overlap with previous burns and previous shrublands. This is the current example of that. So these are from Landsat images. 1987 fire and a 1996 fire that burned. These areas burned in this recent season. And you can see, not a complete, of course, but a substantial overlap and sometimes the same boundaries for the fires in the two different years. Won't go into the detail here, but in a study led by Monica Mermos a few years ago, looking at about 50 years of fire history in the parks and reconstructing the vegetation that was burned, she showed that during the non-extreme drought years, the probability of fire occurring in the tall shrublands is much greater than in the Nothofagus pumilio forests. But when you get into extreme drought years, that's when you can finally burn the tall forest. And so that's where you get this sort of pattern here. In a non-extreme fire year, we expect the fires to burn up through these shrublands, and they often just stop right at the edge of the Nothofagus pumilio forests. Then you get a drought like 1999, which was one of the driest years on record in this region. Then fires can go all the way up through the Nothofagus pumilio forest. This fire actually jumped over the ridge, came down the other side, eliminates seed source over a vast area, and promotes the replacement of those tall forests by a narrow belt, in some cases, like here, of regeneration. This is from the 1908 fire. It's only about 10 meters of regeneration. That same fire just bit into the old growth forest, only 10 meters or so, and then stopped. But under the extreme weather conditions, fires are able to go all the way through the old growth forests. That sort of pattern has been very well documented in northern Patagonia in recent years. Work led mainly by Juan Paritzis has been documenting the same pattern further south in these study areas here along the eastern side of the Andes. So this is based on Juan mapping all of the fires over an extensive area from Landsat imagery, since our documentary fire records are not adequate for this kind of analysis. All fires that were over 5 hectares he tried to map, and then modeling the probability of fire by different biophysical predictors, topographic position, position on precipitation gradient, and so on. And the strongest predictor of where fire occurs is actually vegetation type. The dot here indicates the probability of fire occurrence. The gray histogram just indicates the area for each one of these vegetation types. So you can see that for the forest types, Nothofagus pumilio, and the evergreen beech, Nothofagus betuloides, we have a much lower probability of fire occurrence compared to these shrubland types here. So he's basically been documenting the pattern over a much greater latitudinal area that previously Monica Mermos had documented for northern Patagonia. In terms of post-fire regeneration failures, we initiated an experiment after the 1999 fires to document some of the factors involved here. So we had some fenced plots, unfenced plots. We actually did this in 5 different ecosystem types. We had watering treatments, and we had some warming treatments with these little glass house open-top chambers, rather. And if you just focus on the triangles, which would be the time series of the seedling survival where they were watered, those are the only ones that survived in the low elevation sites. So the 4 bottom panels are from the low elevation sites, close to the elevation of the Patagonian steppe. Without watering, basically no successful establishment of the tree populations after fire. These are subalpine sites, much cooler sites. There's still a significant decline in survival without the watering. So, I mean, basically it shows if you cook the seedlings and you don't water them, you can kill them. So, where exactly this is happening across a landscape gradient is something that needs to be worked out, but at least we can say that theoretically, lack of moisture availability as a result of increasing temperatures is limiting to tree establishment for all of those species there at the post-fire sites. And one of the final pieces of information then is, well, what are the mechanisms that are responsible for the greater flammability of the tall shrublands compared to the forests? This is work that we've just recently published, again led by Juan Paritzis, for the more southerly areas in Chubut, Patagonia. And we are kind of documenting the obvious. So we're comparing fuel profiles between these closed canopy forests here and these shrublands, most of which are post-fire. Obviously, vertical continuity of fine fuels is great in this situation. It's not, and mechanistically, that's one of the explanations for the differences in flammability. Some people may have read this paper that I was asked to indicate as reading for your seminar, so we can talk about that a little bit later on. This is data from that same paper, too, the unburned forest microclimate compared to the microclimate of both burned shrublands and shrublands that haven't been burned for at least 20 years. And not surprisingly, the microclimate beneath the forest canopy is much cooler and moister than in your tall shrublands. So the overall sort of conceptual model for this is that under extreme drought, you can burn these tall fire-resistant forests in the post-fire environment, especially when you have livestock, which impedes tree regeneration, and you have a microclimate that's, or climate trend actually, which is not conducive to regeneration. Then you get replacement of the forest by shrubland, which results in a positive feedback of more fire, which is going to maintain that landscape in a shrubland as opposed to forest. This is based on the idea that if you look at time since fire and some indicator of flammability, that in contrast to what we tend to assume for most coniferous forests in the western U.S., we actually, with this humpback curve, we have maximum flammability in the early post-fire stages when it's dominated by shrublands. You may get a transition to beech forest canopy eventually, and once you do, then it's going to be a lot harder to burn that forest. And this is a pattern that we're documenting with very similar research in New Zealand beech forests as well. Okay, a couple quick comments about land use impacts. So the key finding of numerous studies of the impact of the introduced livestock and the deer and the European hares at post-fire sites is that they simply impede tree regeneration. So they tend to promote the replacement of the post-fire vegetation as resprouting shrublands. There has been a massive planting of exotic trees, mostly conifers from North America, which are transforming landscapes into a more flammable condition, at least in terms of fire severity. I'll show you some examples in a second, and I'll make a couple comments about the human side of this. So we've done experimental work with animal exclosures that basically support that conclusion that I just presented, that the introduced animals are favoring the survival of shrubs and impeding tree regeneration. In response to massive burning in areas in the Aysén district of Patagonia in Chile, and massive burning in the 1950s, 1960s, they started planting introduced conifers for watershed protection, basically, to a certain extent also for timber production. I did take that photo in 1976 when we were working on a project about how to use native species for reforestation projects. From the next photo, I guess, or from that photo, you might say that maybe our project failed because they certainly have not used native species. So this is mostly ponderosa pine plantation that has been used for reforestation in this area. All the pine species that have been planted, which would be Monterey pine and ponderosa and lodgepole pine, but especially lodgepole, have become very invasive. And it's a huge conservation, restoration problem now in Patagonia. You can see that where they've planted ponderosa pine plantation here, we're creating very homogeneous fuels, can support a crown fire. In contrast to this would be the typical native mosaic of the vegetation where you're much less likely to get spread of canopy fires. They've done some wild and crazy things in some areas where in their araucaria forests, they have enriched the forests through planting conifers. Again, changing the potential for fire behavior. This is a plantation of Monterey pine, which was fairly mature when it burned about 4 years ago, and this is the regeneration, natural regeneration of that. So as these pine plantations do burn, it seems like we're going to get more and more pines. This is an example from Aysén of the lodgepole pine. These are all invasive feral pines. These were not planted at all. It's really become a massive problem. It's getting a lot of attention now. Okay, the human side of this. So we look at the fire statistics from the government agencies and try and figure out, well, how many fires are set by humans, for what purposes, and how many are set by lightning. In the case of the fire records from Chile, prior to the big fire event in the Araucaria forest in 2002, on the form used for fire incident reports, lightning was not considered a possible cause. They just ruled it out. They said, no, we don't have lightning. After the 2002 fire events in the Araucaria forest that were very obviously ignited by lightning, now we start to have some data on lightning ignitions from the documentary records. Likewise, in the case of Argentina, there are, first of all, news reports about in this event of 2015, people said, no, it was started by lightning. Then you get headlines like this that say that there are real estate interests involved in these fires. What eventually is going to get into the official report, I don't know. But one way to get around that sort of problem is to do ethnographic research, such as this work done by Daniela Marini, who worked for us as a field assistant on an ecological project first. Then she went to Yale and she's Argentinian, to work in political ecology, and now she's in our PhD program. And she went around and interviewed 60 people that work in the firefighting, fire mitigation, resource management fields in Chubut to try and find out really why fires are being set. And she finished this a couple of years ago, and notice, she got people to admit that, firefighters set fires so they can get paid. It happens. Real estate agents set fire for a variety of purposes, to intimidate people, to sell land. There's been a huge increase in the ownership of large estates and forested areas, even Fitzroy Forest, amazingly, by very, very wealthy international people. There is a relatively new native forest law in Argentina which prohibits clearing of native forest. So if you want to develop a big estate and golf course on property with native forest on it, there now is a motive to burn it first. So this is why I can't give you, very certain answers about the relative importance of intentionally set fires versus lightning ignited fires. Because when there is a lightning ignition and you're an arsonist and you don't want to get blamed, what do? You run out there and you start the fires that you wanted to start at the same time. Or when a fire starts on your neighbor's property, you go out and start fires and blame it on the neighbor's first ignition. So to summarize then, I would say that what's happening in Patagonia is an example of what's been determined committed ecosystem change. Given the climate trends and what we know about the positive feedbacks from initial burning of the forests, it seems likely that we're going to have a substantial decrease in the amount of forest along that ecotone with the drier vegetation types. I'm not saying the rainforests are going to completely disappear in the next few decades, but certainly there is a decrease in the amount of forest. And although it's very difficult to measure it quantitatively, the land use practices of the introduced livestock and the plantations of conifers and now the invasive pines spreading all over the Patagonian steppe are contributing to the increased landscape climbability, which raises lots of management policy questions, which at some point I'd be glad to hear opinions about. So thanks very much. Pete.
So you described this change from relatively fire-resistant nopophagus towards the more fire-prone shrublands. You showed the change in the SAM and unclear to me is, are you saying that this current shift is something unique happening now related to changes in human land use and climate change? Or have these kinds of shifts happened before and we're just seeing it again?
Yeah. Yeah, we've certainly, well, it depends on time scale too. But let's talk about sort of a tree ring time scale and documentary record time scale, so maybe a few hundred years. The reconstruction, the tree ring reconstruction of Sam, that Ricardo Villalba and his collaborators did, show that Sam is off the scale for the last several hundred years. Okay, so as a potential driver, that creates the impression of somewhat a unique situation. We have had other episodes of extreme drought and widespread fires, but they're not at the same magnitude now that we're seeing, at least beginning to see, like in 2015. So 1908 to 1912 was a time period of drought and also European colonization. So we had an increase in ignition sources there too. And there was a huge episode of landscape change at that time. The mid-1940s, 1943, 44, was another time period of widespread drought. Also a time period of, well documented from tree ring records now, of death dates of trees just directly due to drought. So if you think of sort of a ratchet model of changes in the landscape driven mostly by warmer temperatures, drier conditions, it's been episodic over time. And when I say maybe this is committed ecosystem change, I'm predicting that it's going to be more continuous and more extreme now. That's my very happy prediction for the future. Yeah. And because of the annual variability, you don't expect it to happen every year or even once every 5 years. But when everything gets lined up and you get these weather conditions, you've got the fuels that are prone to the burning, you get these really widespread events. And we see the lack of tree regeneration. So yeah, I'm not painting a rosy picture for forests in that area over the next few decades.